Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is co-host Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Good. We have a special guest today.
Yeah.
And he is the community organizer for Free the People, and he's calling in. It's an organization he and his wife has started. Matt Kibbe. Matt, welcome to our program.
It's great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Great, and I think a lot of people would remember you because you spent a few years with Freedom Works, I think over a decade, and that was very much involved in the Tea Party movement, and you started this organization in 2015. So, and you've always been identified with the libertarian movement. Am I not correct that you went to Grove City and you knew Hans Sennholz?
Hans Sennholz was my intellectual mentor, as he was for you as well.
Yeah, that's a good connection because he was one of the first Austrians that I met and got to know personally and read a lot of his. And I was fascinated with the fact that he was one of the very few that got a PhD under Mises. So that is a significant relationship there. But you know, Matt, we came across an article that you wrote in, I think in 2014, and at that time, I guess you were a little bit more optimistic than now. That's the way I sort of assume. You said that the Tea Party won't go away, but this year you wrote something that sounded a little more pessimistic because you said the Tea Party is dead now. Do you want to explain that a little bit, or exactly what you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think that I'm a community organizer, and sometimes I say that to trigger my conservative friends because I think anyone that cares about liberty should be organizing people to do so. And preceding the Tea Party, of course, was your effort to create a new liberty movement, and I think the Tea Party probably drafted on that. And from 2008 to say 2012, the Tea Party was perhaps one of the most consequential social movements in American history, second only perhaps to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And I'm a Tea Party guy. I was a Tea Party organizer. A lot of my friends are Tea Partiers. But if the measure of the Tea Party was that ethos about limiting the size of government, in 2009 you could go to any Tea Party rally and ask people why they were there. They would say, I'm here to defend my individual liberty, to return to fiscal conservatism, and to defend our constitutional rights. Everybody said the same thing. That was the ethos. At some point, politics, as it always does, kind of corrupted the Tea Party. I think we probably got too involved in Republican politics. And fast forward to Donald Trump, he has in a lot of ways split the Tea Party right in half. Some people think that the Tea Party is great. Some people think that Donald Trump is great, but others think that Donald Trump is exploding spending. So when I say the Tea Party has died, I'm arguing that the incentives for politicians, particularly Republican politicians, to not spend us into oblivion clearly have gone away. In 2010, 2011, every Republican was singing from that song sheet. You don't hear hardly anybody talking about the budget anymore, save our friends like Justin Amash and Thomas Massey. So if the Tea Party is a social movement that is supposed to impact spending, it's not there anymore. That doesn't mean that the liberty movement is dead. I actually think that the liberty movement is probably bigger than it's ever been, but it's evolving, it's getting younger, it's focusing on a broader set of liberty issues than just the budget. And I hope that replaces, improves upon, grows a new Tea Party, so to speak.
Right. I think Daniel has a question for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, Matt, most people remember the birth of the Tea Party back in December of '07 when there was kind of a spontaneous money bomb for Dr. Paul's campaign. It was the 234th anniversary of the original Boston Tea Party, and that really kind of put the Ron Paul presidential race on the map, of course. But the movement that sprung from that, sort of as you point out, looked less and less like a Ron Paul movement, and more, and actually in your Reason piece that we referred to earlier, you kind of blame Sarah Palin, John McCain, and a few others. And I wonder, you know, what happened? How did they drop, for example, the foreign policy, which is the center of the Ron Paul presidential campaigns? That was completely dropped as an issue. And did the Tea Party move toward the Republicans? Did the Republicans move to take over the Tea Party? You know, what was that dynamic? I mean, you've been in Washington, you understand how these things work. Did they sense that there's a dynamism that they had to grab onto?
Well, it's a broad cultural movement, and it was famously leaderless, despite what the left said. There was nobody in charge of the Tea Party. That, of course, made it susceptible to some enterprising politician like a Sarah Palin jumping up on stage and saying, I'm the Tea Party. Michelle Bachman unilaterally decided that she was going to start a Tea Party caucus. She didn't get permission from all of the activists to do that. And I like to remind people that there was something called a Tea Party Debt Commission, which was crowdsourced. I was part of that effort. And when we actually had Tea Parties, vets, military retirees actually run the military budget part of that. And that was, from a Washington perspective, a very radical budget. They were willing to take on defense spending. They were willing to take on foreign policy. They were willing to cut across the board, leaving no sacred cows on the table. So that ethos, I think, was there in 2009, 2010, somewhat 11 and 12, but it evaporated over time. It got diluted. And part of that was the pressure to come up with a slate of candidates. And I argued then, and I argue even more passionately now, that we shouldn't just jump on board for the better of two evils. We should hold the standard that only certain candidates that pass all of these sort of basic fundamental values things, right, those are the ones we should support. And the Tea Party stopped doing that. And at some point, it just became, we got to save the Senate for Republicans. And at that point, it lost its philosophical basis.
See, I think obviously intellectual matters and beliefs have to be eventually translated into policy. And of course, I was involved in political parties as well for a lot of years, several decades. But I still don't place them high in order, you know, the political system or the party system. And therefore, I don't really measure things by that, because I see what's happening as an intellectual movement more than just social. Intellectual, the ideas have to be sound. I think Austrian economics is a sound position. And I think we've had a lot of influence. I think the libertarian message has done fairly well in spite of what you hear about Washington, D.C. and what you get from the media. It sounds like we don't even exist. But when you look at the influence, say, on nullification, the drug war has changed. What about the emphasis on the Federal Reserve, which is a major economic issue? And I think the success of YAL is a reflection of young people. When people say, well, they're all Bernie Sanders, is it the wave of the future? Are the socialists really the wave of the future? Could you touch on that a little bit about, you know, maybe we're overly critical about ourselves because we measure everything by the media and the parties rather than and then by Bernie Sanders, rather than saying, are we making advances in some places that are really important? I was always very pleased that I called attention to our central bank.
Yeah, well, you know, if you look at the real indicators of social change, cultural, I was at y'all last night with our two friends, Thomas Massey and Justin Amash. And I have to tell you, every year I go to that conference and it's bigger and the quality of the young people gets better and better. They have those values, they have those ideas. All of them perhaps have read a little bit about Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, but they also have a broader skill set. There's lots of diversity, there's lots of ability there. If you want to measure social movement, that's how you do it. Politics is a lagging indicator, and who is president is the ultimate lagging indicator. You got to go downstream of all that stuff and focus on the values that matter. And in a very superficial way, I've said this will probably upset you, but in a very superficial way, Bernie Sanders sort of followed the Ron Paul model. He was always the same guy. He's been a socialist since he was a kid. He was a socialist in the House. He's a socialist now. And that authenticity at a very superficial level was very appealing to young people, the same types of people that were turned on to the Ron Paul revolution. And of course, at a superficial level, he talks about the Federal Reserve. He talks about endless war. There's actually a couple issues we would agree with him on. But most people don't dig deeper than that. And I think that's our challenge as a movement moving forward. I'd love to talk to these young people who think they're democratic socialists, because I think we have better answers to the concerns they have about the drug war. There's a government reason why the drug war kills so many people. There's a government reason why the drug war incarcerates so many people. You go to criminal justice. You go to the fact that we've been at war for their entire lives. This is a story about abuse of government power. So I think the challenge for our movement today is not that we're not a big enough cadre of people who believe in liberty, but that our audience is so much bigger, and we need to be talking to people who have never heard of the Austrian school. They've never heard of libertarianism. Let's go reach them.
Right. Well, I find your comments about Bernie's very interesting, because Bernie and I got along quite well on the issues we agreed with. And I called it coalition building, and he was decent on civil liberties, and he certainly was decent on foreign policy. So in that sense, that's part of our message. So I think that there's a big difference between coalitions and what I think maybe you sense something wrong with the way the Tea Party movement went, and the politicians take over, and they build in a consensus. They want bipartisanship, not bringing two groups people together by firm beliefs and not sacrificing your belief, but capitulating and coming to that messy middle. And I think that's quite a bit different. So I think libertarians ought to at least talk to the people. See, I talked a lot and worked with Dennis Kucinich, and we certainly didn't agree on the economic matters. So Daniel.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up some current event, actually, because this hit me in the morning, and I thought this might be kind of a fun thing to throw at Matt. But your website, you don't focus a lot on foreign policy, which is what we do a lot on this show, but you do have a little section called Defend Peace. And I really like this little explanation you had. Free the People stands for peace, not permanent war, as the only foreign policy consistent with liberty. And that sounds great. So I was reading Zero Hedge this morning, one of our favorite sites. Listen to this headline: durable goods orders disappoint, but military spending saves the day. Did you see that one?
Yeah,
I knew you would. Third
typical.
month in a row of massive military spending increases have saved us because the durable goods purchase orders have gone way down. So this to me seems like a perfect example of what's wrong with the economy. And Zero Hedge, of course, they get it, and they said, well, of course we know war is a racket, but this seems to encapsulate this idea that military spending is driving our economy.
Well, it's driving everything. Like, the permanent war is driving our fiscal crisis. It's driving this bipartisan collusion where neoconservatives in both parties put everything else aside: our civil liberties, our fiscal futures, the ability for us to feed our families because of high tax rates and all that stuff. It's all driven by the fact that there's a consensus in Washington that more war is better. And on this, I think we could all say that Trump talking to some of our international enemies, people are all upset about him talking to Putin. They're all upset about him talking to Kim Jong-un. And as Senator Rand Paul has said, and a number of liberty Republicans have said, you know what? Talking is better than bombs. I thought that was common sense, but most people in Washington, they love war. And it's sickening, it's dangerous, and that's the culture we have to break up.
Right. One thing that I had to deal with in Washington was we would have a coalition, maybe the progressives and the libertarian conservatives, on some of these war issues. And they would vote against the war, that is, initiating battle. But they thought the easy out would be, well, foreign aid and sanctions, punish them because they're not detrimental. And I never went along with that because I thought sanctions were a pretty serious matter. How do you handle that? Do you think there's a point where sanctions can be good, or is it an all or nothing for you?
I'm generally quite skeptical of sanctions. I think they tend to punish the people in the countries where there are socialist dictators. It undermines the ability for people to work around that oppression. So I fall into the sort of free market camp that thinks that sanctions are ineffective. I think they were obviously ineffective in Cuba. If our goal was to undermine Fidel Castro 10,000 years later, the Castro regime by some other name is still the same thing. So I'm skeptical of that. I happen to believe that trade and cooperation is how you undermine tyrants. Speech and the ability of people to get access to outside goods and services and information and values and people, that's how you undermine totalitarians. And very few people in Washington appreciate that, because so much about politics is about planning things from the top down. Our foreign policy is about planning things from the top down. We're trying to oppose our sets of values, our version of Republican democracy in other countries. It's wildly naive to think that we're smart enough to micromanage and redesign these other countries, but that's the entire basis of our foreign policy, and I think sanctions are part of that arrogance.
That's a kind of a funny and ironic point that you make, Matt, because you talk about our foreign policy in Washington as planning from the top down, which is not a good way to counter socialist dictators, because it's a socialist impulse in itself. Our great 5-year plan to do this or that. So it's sort of ironic. But you touched on neocons, and it's actually a question I have, because it is interesting. You're in Washington. You're watching what's happening. The neocons, in terms of foreign policy, have really had an iron grip on Washington. They're well funded by the military-industrial complex. A lot of them by foreign governments. But it's interesting to think about their demise or their strength. It seems to me, on one hand, you have people like Bolton and Nikki Haley. They seem to have their mask tied to the president, at least. And then you have the opposition, Crystal, who hates the president, but they're all still neocons. Would you say this is kind of Lenin, control the opposition, be the opposition, or what's going on with the neocons in D.C.?
Well, they're for one thing, they're persistent, and Washington is their business model, and politics and apparatchik control of the process. This is what neocons are good at, and you could argue that we need to get better at it. Like so many libertarians don't want to get their hands dirty and get involved in politics or policy, or certainly work inside government. But I worked on Capitol Hill. Obviously, Dr. Paul worked on Capitol Hill. I think it's good to understand how this stuff works. It's good to be on the inside to understand what the incentives are and who the enemy is when you're trying to change that stuff. It doesn't mean we should play the neocons game. Our job is not to control the levers of power. Our job is outside to educate Americans across the spectrum on why this is such a corrosive ideology. It's not so much about the size of government, it's about power. And if war feeds their power, they're for more war, just regardless of how many American men and women get killed in the process.
Matt, you spend a lot of time on economic policy, and one of the most misunderstood issues are the trade deficits. And if there's a trade deficit with one country, all of a sudden that is a big, big economic and political issue, and it justifies, theoretically, the Trumpisms who say what we need are sanctions and tariffs to iron out these trade deficits. But, the trade deficits are a little bit more complex than that, and they're not necessarily and automatically harmful. But my question is, do you believe that trade deficits that we do have are not exactly within a free market system? Because we don't have it. We have this monetary system where we get to issue the reserve currency of the world, which makes it much easier for us to buy stuff and create some of this. But nobody really talks about, that we could be, guilty of participating in making things worse, because we end up buying cheaper goods, but it's all China's fault. So do you deal with this trade imbalance with introducing the understanding of how the central bank works and why we have the reserve currency of the world, which in the long term probably isn't the best thing for us?
Yeah, and you've obviously been the leader on this subject of the Federal Reserve and how they manipulate the value of money and the perversions that creates. It sends false signals. It might, in fact, create misincentives to buy more from other countries than we could produce here. I think the answer, though, is not protectionism. And I'm 100% a free trader, and I even think that for all of the corruptions of these multilateral trade agreements and all of those provisions, it's better to trade. I would love to have freer trade. I would love for other countries to reduce their barriers, and Donald Trump at least has paid lip service to that. But what we really have to get at, and we've already talked about the other issue, I think the two core issues that are going to affect the future of America, one is getting a handle and limiting the war government and our ability to engage in permanent war and expand upon that again and again and again. That is going to destroy America if it keeps up. The other thing, and these things go hand in hand, as you know, is the way that we manipulate our currency, the way the Federal Reserve punishes some people and rewards others, depending on when they pay the game, and that transfer of wealth from people that are holding dollars to Wall Street insiders. This is all one big fat mess, and we got to lift the lid on it, and we got to get people to understand that, yes, there's righteous anger about insiders and crony capitalists colluding with government to game the system. But let's not abandon free market principles while we try to go at the real problems.
Well, I think we're getting ready to close, but let me make a short comment on this. Years ago, when I spent more time with conversations with Hans Sandholt, he used to say to me, he says that the setup that we have now allows us to export our inflation. You know, the dollars go overseas and they aren't all spent here, so it contains the price inflation, is what he was saying. So he didn't see this as much of an advantage. But Matt, I want to thank you very much for being with us today, and I'm sure our viewers will enjoy this program. But thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Very good, and I want to thank all our viewers today for joining us with this interview with Matt Tibby. Please come back soon.